The Dr. Heidegger experiment story. Dr. Heidegger was a strange old man. Once, he invited 4 friends to meet at his house. 3 of his guests were old men with white beards. Their names were Mr. Medborn, Mr. Gaskin, and Colonel Killigrew. The 4th person was an elderly woman with white hair. She was called the Widow Weischer.
All of these people had lived very sad and unfortunate lives. Years ago Mr. Medborn had been a rich man. But because he was greedy, he made some bad business deals and lost his fortune. Now he had to beg for money. Mr. Gaskin had been a famous politician. But he was dishonest. He was caught. As the widow Weischerli, she was one quite beautiful. But she was very conceited. She thought that she was the most beautiful woman in the town, but she was not beautiful now. The 3 men had each loved her very much when they were young. Once, they almost killed each other fighting over her. But that was many years ago. "My dear old friends," said Dr. Heidegger, "please come with me to my laboratory. I need your help with a little experiment." Dr. Heidegger showed them the way. Dr. Heidegger's laboratory was certainly an unusual place. It was a large, dark room covered with spider webs and dust. Around the walls stood tall wooden bookcases that were filled with books. Between 2 of bookcases there was a large painting of a young woman in a long silk dress. More than 50 years ago, Dr. Heidegger was going to marry this woman. The day before their wedding, she suddenly became ill. Dr. Heidegger gave her some medicine, but she died that evening. Some people said that Dr. Heidegger made a mistake and gave her the wrong medicine. "My dear old friends," repeated Dr. Heidegger, "may I count on your help with my little experiment?" Dr. Heidegger did not wait for an answer. He walked slowly across the room to one of the bookcases. He opened a book and removed a rose from its pages. Yes, it was a rose, or what once was a rose. The red flower had turned brown and seemed ready to crumble to dust in the doctor's hands. Dr. Heidegger said, "55 years ago this rose was given to me by the woman I want to marry. Her name was Selina Ward. You can see her picture hanging there on the wall. I was going to wear this rose in my jacket on our wedding day." Dr. Heidegger looked at his guest and said, "For 55 years I saved this rose between the pages of a book. For 55 years I have treasured this rose." Dr. Heidegger asked suddenly, "Do you think that old rose could ever bloom again?" "No, never," said the widow Weischerli. "You might as well ask if an old woman's wrinkled face could ever be young again." "Watch," said Dr. Heidegger. They were sitting around a table. In the middle of the table was a large glass vase. It was filled with a liquid that looked like water. There were also 4 glasses on the table. Dr. Heidegger picked up the vase. He poured some of the water onto the rose. At first nothing happened. But then the old out rose began to bloom. The rose turned red. A moment later, it looked as fresh and lovely as it did 55 years ago. The doctor's friends smiled and clapped their hands. "That was a wonderful trick," said Mr. Gaskin. "How did you do it?" "My friends," said Dr. Heidegger, "that was no trick. Have you ever heard of the Fountain of Youth?" "The Fountain of Youth," exclaimed Mr. Gaskin. Yes, said Dr. Heidegger. Water from that fountain make everything young again. Ponce de Leon, the Spanish explorer, searched for the fountain centuries ago. Did he ever find it? Asked the widow Wycherly. No, answered Dr. Heidegger. He was looking in the right place. I have learned that the fountain is hidden in a forest near Lake Macaco in the southern part of Florida. Dr. Heidegger's guests were astonished and looked at each other in surprise. A friend from mine, said Dr. Heidegger, knows that I am interested in things like this. He sent me some water from the fountain. It is here in this vase. Colonel Killigrew coughed softly. He smiled and shook his head. He did not believe a word of the doctor's story. The colonel started at the vase and then asked, "But tell me this, doctor. What would happen if a person drank that water?" "You shall see for yourself," said Dr. Heidegger. "Yes, all of you shall see." Dr. Heidegger pointed to the vase. "My friends," he said, "you might drink as much of this water as you wish. Grow as young as you want to be. As for me, it took me a long time to grow old. I am in no hurry to grow young again. I will be happy just to watch." While he was speaking, Dr. Heidegger had been filling the 4 glasses with water from the fountain of youth. The water sparkled with bubbles and had a very sweet smell. The old people were eager to drink the water at once. "Wait," said Dr. Heidegger. "Wait. Before you drink, think about the mistakes you made when you were young. You would not want to make the same mistakes again." "Of course not," said Colonel Killigrew. "Of course not," said the others. They all agreed that if they could live their lives over, they would be bitter people. "Drink then," said the doctor. "I am very glad that I selected you for my experiment." What trembling hands! The 4 people raised them. A moment later, they noticed a change. They felt happier and better. The widow Wycherly put her hands up to her head and adjusted her hat. She was beginning to feel like a young woman again. "Give us more of this wonderful water," they cried. "We are younger, that is true. But we are still too old. Quick, give us more." "What is your hurry?" said Dr. Heidegger. "It took you many years to grow old. Surely, you can wait a few more minutes to grow young. But I will give you more water." Dr. Heidegger filled their glasses again. The 4 guests quickly drank the liquid. Then could it be true? Their eye grew bright and clear. Their white hair grew dark. They were now 3 men who were middle-aged and a young woman. "My dear widow, you are beautiful again," cried Colonel Killigrew. He was staring at her face. The widow knew that Colonel Killigrew did not always tell the truth. She jumped up and ran to the mirror to look at herself. She was afraid that she would see deep lines in her face. Meanwhile, the 3 men were acting in a very strange way. Mr. Gaskin had climbed up on the chair. He was waving his arms like a politician. "Vote for me," he was shouting. "Vote for me. Vote for me." Colonel Killigrew was singing loudly. At the same time, he was thinking about dinner. He was imagining plate piled with food and glasses filled with wine. On the other side of the table, Mr. Medborn was figuring out a shrewd business deal that would make him rich. As for the widow Wycherley, she stood in front of the mirror and kept smiling at her face. It was like meeting a lost friend, a friend she loved more than everything in the world. Finally, she turned away from the mirror and skipped over to Dr. Heidegger. "My dear doctor," she said, "may I have another glass?" "Certainly," said Dr. Heidegger. "See, I have already filled 4 more glasses." There, in fact, stood the 4 glasses on the table. The wonder water sparkled like diamonds. The 4 people again drank the water. A moment later they felt young. "We are young! We are young!" they cried with joy. They were like youngsters who were having a good time. They laughed and shouted and ran wildly around the room. The widow Wycherley rushed up to the doctor's chair. There was smiled on her rosy face. "Doctor, you dear old man," she said, "come dance with me." "Please excuse me," he answered softly. "I am old and sick. I have not danced for many years." The doctor pointed to the others and said, "But any of these 3 young men would be happy to dance with you." "Dance with me," shouted Colonel Killigrew. "No, dance with me," yelled Mr. Gaskin. "Dance with me," exclaimed Mr. Medborn. They all gathered around her. Mr. Gaskin grabbed her by one hand and Mr. Medborn grabbed her by the other. Colonel Killigrew threw his arm around the young woman's waist. They were young and in love. Each man pulled her to himself, shouting over and over, "Dance with me! Dance with me!" The moment later they were shoving each other. Then they were fighting. They were grabbing fiercely at each other's throats. They wanted to kill each other. As they struggled back and forth, the table was knocked over. The vase fell to the ground and smashed into 1,000 pieces. The precious water from the fountain of youth flowered slowly across the floor. "Gentlemen! Gentlemen!" exclaimed Dr. Heidegger. "You must stop this fighting at once." They stopped and looked at old Dr. Heidegger. He was sitting in his chair. He was looking at the rose from 55 years ago. "My poor Sylvia's rose," said Dr. Heidegger, holding it up to the light. "It appears to be fading again." And so it was. While his guests were looking at it, the rose began to shrink. Soon it was as dry and brown as when the doctor first took it out of his book. Dr. Heidegger's guests suddenly felt cold and began to shiver. They wondered if they would also grow old again, like the doctor's rose. They looked at each other and watched as their hair turned gray. "Are we old again?" they asked Dr. Heidegger. "Yes, friends," said Dr. Heidegger, "you are old. And look! The water from the fountain of youth has spilled on the ground." "Well, I am not sorry about that. No. If the fountain were here right now, I would not drink from it." The doctor looked closely at his friends. "I see that you have learned nothing from your mistakes," he said. "That is the lesson you have taught me." But the doctor's not listening to him. They were making plans to leave for Florida at once. There they hoped to find the fountain of youth. They wanted to drink from it morning, noon, and night.